active reload was once a brilliant way to make intense and hectic shooting games even more engaging, but as the years have gone by, it's become a mechanic that's been more trouble than it's worth. Going back to Gears of War in 2006, the active reload was a game changer, with the nature of Gears of War battles being full-on explosive horde-style firefights. Having that added stress of hitting the perfect reload was pure bliss, as missing the timing could lead to the Locust overwhelming you. I can't speak to the multiplayer as I'm a single-player only gamer, but from my perspective, the active reload may have been alienating to the newer and casual fans of the series, but again, I have no experience to base that on. With each arena feeling like a desperate fight for survival, finding a way to make sure that players never had a chance to catch their breath in a battle was a move of sheer genius. It really makes you feel like the underdog in this, with your faulty weapons that can just jam. Add on top of that the overwhelming numbers that each battle put you against, and active reload was destined to become a core part of the Gears of War franchise, and possibly a staple of the genre in the way that Halo's weapon swapping mechanic had been. But it never ultimately took off. I guess I would attribute it to only being a barrier in multiplayer games, and to the fact that it's more frustrating to miss an active reload and to die to a real player. There's just something more aggravating about dying to a human player than an AI, probably due to primal urges to be the best, but I'm no psychologist. The active reload never really took off outside of Gears of War, but recently 2 games have used the mechanic, and they did so to varying degrees of success, which makes me think I figured out what makes the active reload work in a game. Before we get to my thesis, let's take a look at those 2 games, starting with Returnal, which is as chaotic as a shooter can be, almost qualifying as a third-person bullet hell with just how crazy some of these fights can get, adding the severe consequence that death brings with it, and it creates a much similar feeling to the Gears of War battles. But unlike Gears of War, Returnal doesn't give you cover to hide behind, meaning you always have to keep moving, and if you always have to be moving, then you always have to be shooting, as the fast pace always makes you want to fight back. The active reload in return helps add to the horror-like nature of the game. In Doom, the player is always moving and shooting, but notably, there's no reload whatsoever. This is because Doom is a power fantasy where the player always wants to be slaying demons with divine double-barreled retribution. By not forcing the player into a state of vulnerability with a reload, Doom is able to maintain the power fantasy for the duration of its gunfights. Meanwhile, Returnal frequently gives you moments of vulnerability, and with the heavy penalty of dying, these moments create intense terror in the player's mind. So by giving the player a way to minimize this weakness, the active reload ends up benefiting the game from a gameplay and atmospheric point of view, as it's much more critical to hit those perfect reloads. These are great examples of active reloads, but this next game highlights the problem with throwing them into your game without considering the consequences. Star Wars Outlaws also features a cover-based shooting system like Gears of War, but in Outlaws, the active reload only interrupts the gameplay and breaks the flow of shooting, which isn't great as cover-based shooters are already much slower paced than movement-based shooters. The difference between Outlaws and Gears of War is tone and intensity. Gears of War is a desperate struggle for survival as humanity scrapes together whatever defenses it can against a threat so much more powerful than them. The Locusts hilariously outnumber them, and that grungy feeling of having faulty guns plays so well into that struggle. While Star Wars Outlaws also has a grungy feel as Kay is an outlaw, and it makes sense that she would have rickety and malfunctioning weapons, that doesn't translate to the gameplay because the firefights aren't intense enough to make pausing the action an intense experience. See, Outlaws lets you upgrade your character in multiple ways, so by the end of the game, Kay is a superhuman with a dozen abilities and buffs backing her up. This is normal for most single-player games, as without those buffs, the gameplay would get incredibly stale as there wouldn't be any progression. But Gears of War doesn't have upgrades of any kind. Your health and damage are the same as when you start the game, meaning that as enemies get stronger, you only have your sharpened skills to rely on. There are other reasons why this works for Gears, like level design and game length, but that's getting off track. Outlaws doesn't have the same intensity in gameplay and atmosphere, and the punishment for death isn't extreme, so handicapping the player with an active reload doesn't make sense for the flow of the game. I'd rather just have a shorter reload that I can duck behind cover for, rather than waiting longer to hit an active reload. The point I'm trying to make is that active reload only benefits a game when it's extremely fast moving and stressful. The extra requirement of having to hit a QuickTime event only has its intended effect when the battle itself is overly engaging, so the player has to divert attention away to reload. Games like Star Wars Outlaws and Guardians of the Galaxy may have included the reload to keep players engaged at every step of the battle like Paper Mario did all those years ago, but shooters are already a demanding experience, and an active reload should be used to handicap the player in difficult fights, rather than as an engagement tool. I'll be back in 2 days. In the meantime, here's a video about why the grunts are the heart of Halo.